They called it a love that stood the test of time. A bond so unbreakable, not even death could sever it. For decades, Yolanda McClain lived quietly in her Texas home, a woman of routine, solitude, and whispered tragedy. Neighbors pitied her, believing she had been abandoned by the love of her life. But they were wrong. Kentrell Dupree never left. He was there all along, rotting beneath the surface of a nightmare too horrifying to imagine. For 32 years, Yolanda carried a secret so disturbing, so unthinkable, that when it finally came to light, it sent shockwaves through an entire community. How does love turn into obsession? How does devotion warp into something so twisted that it defies all logic? And most importantly, how does someone live with a corpse for over 3 decades and convince themselves it's love? Before we dive into this shocking case, take a moment to like this video and subscribe for more chilling tales of love, lies, and the dark secrets people take to the grave. Because sometimes, the most terrifying horrors aren't the ones lurking in the shadows, they're the ones hiding in plain sight. Yolanda "Yo-Yo" McClain had always been the kind of woman who did things her own way, whether the world approved or not. Raised in a strict, church-going household in Fort Worth, Texas, she grew up under the unrelenting rule of her father, Rufus McClain, a man who believed discipline was love and fear was respect. He ran his home with an iron fist, and Yolanda, his only daughter, bore the brunt of it. She wasn't allowed to wear makeup, talk back, or so much as glance at a boy without being reminded of the fire and brimstone waiting for wayward girls. But even as a child, Yolanda had a fire in her that couldn't be tamed. She was rebellious, headstrong, and unafraid to test the limits set before her. By the time she was a teenager, she had mastered the art of sneaking out, rolling up her church skirt to make it just a little shorter, and slipping off to house parties with the same boys her father warned her about. And none of them were more dangerous than Kentrell Kenny Dupree. Kenny wasn't just a bad boy, he was the kind of trouble that left scars. Born on the rougher side of town, he learned early that the world didn't hand out kindness to boys like him. His father was a ghost, his mother worked too much to notice him, and the streets raised him in their own merciless way. By 15, he had already seen the inside of a police station more times than he could count. By 18, he was a small-time hustler with big-time ambitions. And then he met Yolanda. She was everything he liked, bold, beautiful, and unafraid of the fire that came with loving him. And to her, Kenny was freedom. He was the rush of adrenaline she had always craved, the living, breathing rebellion against the suffocating rules of her childhood. When they were together, it was like gasoline meeting a lit match, explosive, unpredictable, and impossible to put out. Their love wasn't built on stability or security. It was built on passion and defiance. The more people told them they were no good for each other, the tighter they held on. To the outside world, they were just another young couple in love, trying to make it work against the odds. But behind closed doors, their relationship was a storm, violent, chaotic, and always on the verge of destruction. They fought hard, loved harder, and forgave too easily. There were nights when neighbors heard shouting, crashing, Yolanda's voice breaking through the walls in fury or pain. But by morning, they would be wrapped in each other's arms, swearing that their love was stronger than anything that could break them. Yolanda believed Kenny was her destiny. No matter how bad things got, she told herself that love was supposed to hurt, that if it didn't, it wasn't real. But love like that? It never ends in happily ever after. It only ends in tragedy. And for Yolanda and Kenny, the real nightmare hadn't even begun. Kentrell Dupree had a past that stretched far beyond what Yolanda was willing to see. He wasn't just a hustler trying to make ends meet, he was a man with a history steeped in violence, manipulation, and a disregard for consequences. His rap sheet was a revolving door of arrests, assault, theft, drug possession. But somehow, he always slipped through the cracks of the system. Whether it was a lack of evidence, a terrified witness backing out, or his own silver tongue spinning just the right story, Kentrell had a way of making trouble disappear. To Yolanda, none of that mattered. She saw the charm, the raw survival instinct, the man who had been dealt a bad hand and was simply trying to survive in a world that never gave him a fair shot. She convinced herself that if she loved him enough, if she proved her loyalty, she could be the one to save him. But Kentrell didn't want saving. He wanted control. Behind closed doors, their relationship was nothing like the passionate love story Yolanda had once believed in. It was war. A never-ending cycle of violence and regret. The first time he hit her, she told herself it was a mistake. That she had pushed him too far. That the stress, the liquor, the frustration had just gotten the best of him. But then it happened again. And again. Sometimes, it was a slap across the face. Other times, it was worse, hands around her throat, a punch to the stomach that left her gasping for air, a night spent curled in a corner, nursing bruises she couldn't hide. And always, there were the apologies. The promises. The flowers he'd leave on the pillow the next morning. The way he'd hold her, whispering how much he loved her, how she was the only person who had ever truly seen him. And Yolanda stayed. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was love. Maybe, after years of being beaten down, physically, emotionally, she simply didn't know how to leave. By 1992, their relationship had reached a boiling point. The fights were worse, the violence more frequent. Kentrell had grown more paranoid, more possessive. He accused her of cheating when she so much as smiled at another man. He controlled where she went, who she spoke to. And yet, he was the one disappearing for days at a time, coming home with blood on his shirt, smelling like liquor and bad decisions. Then, one day, he was gone. No explanation. No goodbye. Just silence. At first, people assumed he was in jail again. Or dead. It wasn't unusual for men like Kentrell to vanish. He had enemies, a record, a lifestyle that made longevity a rare thing. Yolanda, for the most part, played the part of the abandoned lover. She told people she didn't know where he was. That maybe he had skipped town. That maybe he had finally gotten himself into something he couldn't get out of. And the world moved on. What no one knew was that Kentrell Dupree had never left that house. He was still there. And for the next 32 years, Yolanda would carry a secret so dark, so unfathomable, that when it finally came to light, the truth would be too horrifying for anyone to believe. It started like all the other fights, loud, vicious, inevitable. The walls of that tiny house had absorbed years of their screaming, their violence, their love turned sour. But that night in 1992, something was different. Something inside Yolanda McClain had finally fractured beyond repair. Kentrell was drunk, angrier than usual. He had come home late, smelling like another woman, and Yolanda knew what was coming before the first slap landed. He was unpredictable when he was like this, his rage like a fire with no boundaries. The threats, the insults, the accusations, she had heard them all before. But that night, the look in his eyes was different. He was going to kill her. She saw it in the way he moved, the way he grabbed at her, the way his fingers curled into fists, his knuckles already raw from whatever trouble he had found earlier that night. And for the first time, Yolanda wasn't afraid. She was done. She reached for the first thing her hands could find, a heavy glass ashtray sitting on the coffee table. Before Kentrell could react, she swung with everything she had. The crack was sickening, the sound of glass meeting bone. He stumbled, cursing, clutching his head. But he wasn't finished. He lunged at her again, his hands closing around her throat, squeezing, squeezing. She didn't think. She just reacted. Her fingers found the kitchen knife she had left on the counter earlier that day. She didn't even remember grabbing it. But suddenly, it was in her hands, and then it was in him. The first stab made him stop. The second made him stumble. The third sent him crashing to the floor. She didn't stop. When it was over, the room was silent. No more screaming, no more threats. Just the sound of her own ragged breathing, the knife slick in her trembling hands. She stood there for what felt like hours, staring at him, waiting for him to get up. He always got up. He always came back. But not this time. Kentrell Dupree was dead. The logical thing would have been to call the police. To tell them it was self-defense. But logic had no place in Yolanda's world anymore. Because if she called the police, they would take him away. And for all the pain he had caused her, for all the nights she had spent nursing bruises and swallowing her screams, the thought of Kentrell being gone forever was unbearable. She wasn't ready to let him go. So she didn't. Instead, she cleaned up the blood. She wrapped his body in blankets, careful, tender, as if he were just sleeping. Then she dragged him down to the basement, the place he had always forbidden her to go, the place that had always felt like his. Now, it was where he would stay. In the days that followed, she convinced herself he wasn't really gone. She would talk to him at night, whispering apologies, waiting for him to answer. She kept the basement door locked, as if he might wake up and try to leave. As if their life together wasn't already over. As if she hadn't just buried a part of herself alongside him. The world outside moved on, barely noticing Kentrell's absence. But inside that house, Yolanda was no longer just a woman with a past. She was something else now. Something far more terrifying. The house on Mulberry Street became a place frozen in time. While the rest of the world moved forward, Yolanda McClain lived in a reality of her own creation, a reality where Kentrell Dupree never left. The world saw a woman who had been abandoned, a lover left behind by a man who was never good for her in the first place. But inside that house, behind the locked basement door, a secret decayed in the dark. She kept him dressed, changing his clothes as if he were simply resting, waiting for the day he'd wake up and tell her he forgave her. She would sit beside him in the dim basement light, whispering about her day, about the things he had missed. Sometimes she would laugh at her own jokes, pausing only to listen, as if expecting a chuckle from lips that had long since turned to bone. But it wasn't just conversation. Yolanda cooked meals for him, laying plates of fried chicken and cornbread beside his wrapped body, as if he might get hungry in the night. When the food rotted, she would clean it up and replace it with something fresh. She sprayed the air with perfume, trying to mask the stench of death, though over time, even she became immune to it. Her father, Rufus McClain, never said a word. He lived upstairs, blind to what festered beneath him, or maybe he wasn't blind at all. The old man had long since given up trying to control his daughter, and in his final years, his own mind began to slip. The stench, the locked basement door, the way Yolanda spoke in hushed tones at night as if carrying on a conversation with someone who wasn't there, it should have been enough to raise suspicion. But Rufus never asked. Maybe he was afraid of the truth. Maybe he simply didn't care. The few visitors Yolanda allowed inside never stayed long. They would wrinkle their noses, glancing toward the basement door, but Yolanda always had an excuse. Something died in the walls, she would say with a forced laugh. Ain't nothing but a rat or two. You know how these old houses are. But the questions didn't stop. Friends and distant relatives would ask about Kentrell from time to time, curious about where life had taken him. Yolanda never hesitated in her response. Oh, that fool ran off years ago, she'd say with a dismissive wave. Found himself some little girl, probably living off her money somewhere. The lie came so easily, so naturally, that even she started to believe it. In her mind, Kentrell had never died, he had simply changed. He was still there, still a part of her, still the man she had loved, the man she had fought for, the man she had killed. As the years passed, the basement became more than just a grave. It was a shrine, a place where love and madness intertwined, where guilt and devotion became one and the same. It was her world, her secret, her penance. And for 32 years, no one knew. No one suspected. No one dared to look too closely. The stench hit them before they even stepped inside. It seeped through the walls, a putrid mix of mold, filth, and something far worse, something unmistakably dead. The neighbor had described it as unbearable, a smell so foul it made their stomach turn every time the wind shifted. When the police arrived at the small house on Mulberry Street, they expected to find a decomposing animal, maybe even a forgotten body from some old crime. They never imagined what was waiting for them in the basement. Yolanda McClain answered the door with tired, sunken eyes, her once beautiful face worn down by time and secrets. Her hair, a tangled mess of gray and black, clung to her damp forehead. She gripped the doorknob tightly, as if holding back the truth itself. The officers explained the situation, the overwhelming odor, the neighbors' concerns, the need to inspect the property. She shook her head, voice raspy from years of cigarettes. "Ain't nothing wrong in this house," she muttered. "Just a busted pipe." But the smell told a different story. The officers insisted, and when Yolanda hesitated for a beat too long, one of them gently pushed past her. The moment the basement door creaked open, a wave of decay rolled through the house like a sickness. One officer gagged, covering his mouth with the crook of his arm. Another instinctively reached for his gun, though there was no immediate threat, only something foul and unseen, lurking in the shadows below. Yolanda's voice cracked as she stepped forward, blocking the doorway with her frail body. "Please," she whispered. "Just leave it be." They didn't listen. Flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the damp, flooded basement. Water pooled on the floor, reflecting the trembling beams of light. The officers took slow, careful steps, their boots splashing against the rot-soaked concrete. Then, as the light swept across the far side of the basement, the room seemed to hold its breath. There, on a rusted twin-sized bed, lay the remains of a man frozen in time. Kentrell Dupree's body was eerily intact yet horrifyingly withered. His skin, leathery and shrunken, clung to his bones like a macabre mask. His face was a rigid grimace, teeth exposed through cracked, shrunken lips. He wore a FUBU tracksuit, the once bold colors faded into dusty remnants of a past long gone. His sneakers, still on his feet, had dry-rotted, the soles crumbling at the edges. The officers stood in stunned silence, the weight of the discovery sinking into their chests. One of them finally broke the spell, murmuring a shaken "Jesus Christ." Yolanda stood at the top of the stairs, watching them. There were no tears, no frantic explanations, only a quiet acceptance. When an officer turned to face her, demanding answers, she simply shrugged and said, "I never let him go. He never left me." Forensics teams swarmed the house within the hour. Neighbors gathered outside, whispering in hushed, horrified voices as the coroner's team carried Kentrell's remains out in a body bag. Cameras flashed. Reporters rushed to piece together the details of the unimaginable. How could a man be dead in a house for 32 years without anyone knowing? How could Yolanda live with him, speak to him, care for him, as if he were still alive? The truth had finally come to light, but no one, not the officers, not the forensic experts, not even the nation watching in shock, could truly understand what they had just uncovered. The news spread like wildfire, igniting a media storm that gripped the nation. Headlines screamed of the unthinkable, a woman who had lived with a corpse for over 3 decades, loving a man long after his death. Reporters flooded Fort Worth, swarming the small, weathered house on Mulberry Street where the unimaginable had unfolded. News vans lined the block, cameras flashing as the decayed remains of Kentrell Dupree were carried away in a body bag. The community was shaken to its core. Neighbors who had once greeted Yolanda in passing now spoke of the eerie feeling they'd always had about her house. Former friends, distant relatives, even church members, everyone had a theory, an opinion, a moment of hindsight where they should have seen the signs. But the most haunting question lingered in the air like the stench that had given her secret away. How had no one noticed? For Kentrell's family, the revelation was nothing short of devastating. His mother, Odessa Dupree, collapsed when she heard the news. For years, she had lived with unanswered questions, searching for her son in prisons, on the streets, in whispers of rumors that he had left town. She had clung to hope, believing that one day, Kentrell would walk through her door with that same reckless grin he had always worn. Never in her worst nightmares had she imagined that all along, his body had been decaying beneath another woman's feet. As the case moved to trial, the nation became obsessed with the grotesque details. Courtrooms were packed. News segments dissected every aspect of Yolanda's life. Psychological experts weighed in, debating whether she was a cold-blooded killer or a woman so deeply broken by abuse that reality had unraveled around her. The defense argued the latter. They painted Yolanda as a tragic figure, a victim of prolonged domestic violence whose mind had fractured under the weight of fear and control. Witnesses described the bruises, the whispered apologies, the years of manipulation Kentrell had inflicted on her. Mental health experts testified that she suffered from severe PTSD and dissociative episodes, that by the time she killed Kentrell, she had already been living in a prison of her own making. But the prosecution had another story to tell. They called her actions what they were, monstrous. They played recordings of her police interrogation, where she spoke of dressing Kentrell's body, of keeping him by her side as if he were still alive. They showed pictures of the decayed corpse, the rusted bed, the eerie stillness of a life frozen in death. This wasn't just a crime of passion, they argued. This was control in its most grotesque form. The jury listened. They watched. They recoiled at the evidence. And in the end, after weeks of disturbing testimony, they reached a verdict. Yolanda McClain was found guilty of second-degree murder, abuse of a corpse, and concealment of a body. When the judge asked if she had anything to say before sentencing, she simply lifted her head, met his gaze, and said in a voice void of regret, "I loved him more dead than alive." The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. Then, the gavel. Others called her a victim. But one thing was undeniable, Yolanda McClain had loved Kentrell Dupree beyond reason, beyond sanity, beyond life itself. And in the end, that love had destroyed them both. Some stories haunt the mind long after the last word is spoken. The case of Yolanda McClain is one of them, a love story so twisted that it blurred the line between devotion and madness. For 32 years, she lived in the shadow of a dead man, preserving his decayed remains as if time had never moved forward. Was it grief? Was it guilt? Or was it something far darker, something beyond what the human mind can truly comprehend? This case forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth: love, in its most extreme form, can be just as dangerous as hatred. What begins as passion can morph into possession. What starts as devotion can spiral into delusion. Yolanda may have believed she was holding on to love, but in reality, she was clinging to a nightmare of her own making. And yet, the most chilling part of this story isn't just what happened, it's the questions it leaves behind. Could this tragedy have been prevented? Did the warning signs go unnoticed, or did people choose to look away? How do we recognize when love crosses the line into something far more sinister? And most disturbingly, how many others are out there, trapped in a love that has rotted beyond repair? If this story shocked you, stay with us. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because the darkest corners of human nature are far from empty. There are more stories waiting to be uncovered, more secrets lurking just beneath the surface. And sometimes, the scariest monsters aren't the ones hiding in the shadows, they're the ones who believe they're in love.